Then Yoda slowly blinked his large eyes at Atticus Finch. "Strong the Force is in you, my friend, but a lesson you must learn. A person you understand never, until things from his point of view you consider." Atticus nodded. "I will teach that to my children, although possibly with the words in a slightly different order."
Kion.
Yoda blinked gravely. "Name you must the Girl Scout." "Actually," said Atticus, "neither one of my kids is a Girl Scout." "Wrong did that come out," said Yoda.
Kion, what are you doing?
"I know what you're about to say, Greg, that I have no right to tamper with an indelible fiction character like Atticus Finch, but that is so top-down, it's so paternalistic, it's so rigid. These characters exist for us to make new kinds of meaning, and as an artist,
That's not what I was going to say.
It's not?
I was just going to ask if you think it's clear enough that in your version Atticus is black.
All right, how about this? "You know what?" said Yoda. "Remind me, you do, of a cross between Mace Windu and Lando Calrissian."
So he's like a Lando Windu.
Totally.
That nails it down for me.
That frees me up to polish the section where R2-D2 is the first robot to attend the Alabama public schools. Today on the show, tomorrow's publication of books by Harper Lee and Ta-Nehisi Coates. Also, Ted Cruz's battle with the New York Times. And now, the nation's foremost Boo Radley reenactor, Colin McEnroe.
That indeed would be me. So a little bit later on in the show, we are going to talk to Dylan Byers from Politico about a battle between Ted Cruz and the New York Times. A battle which, by the way, only Ted Cruz can win at this point. And then towards the end of the show, a regular contributor, Julia Pistel, will join me. She is also the co-host of a book podcast called Literary Disco. We'll be talking about the publication on Tuesday of Harper Lee's new old novel, the novel she wrote before she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. That publication on Tuesday is being sort of treated as, at least by the book-selling industry, as some kind of mega merchandising event. They're going to, for example, Barnes & Noble outlets are going to open 2 hours early. People are going to show up. They're going to get their reserve copies. They're going to wait in line dressed as Boo Radley. I'm not sure that's going to really happen. But anyway, all of that is ahead of us. But we do want to begin with the other publishing event of Tuesday. And I don't know whether Random House sort of figured out what a good pairing this was going to be, because I don't know whether they even quite understood what kind of book the new Harper Lee book was going to be. But Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which is going to be published later this year, was moved up for publication to Tuesday. It is also, in its own way, a long-awaited book. It has been praised by a lot of different people. The only blurb he wanted was from Toni Morrison. So it was he didn't know Toni Morrison. Neither did his editor. They submitted it. She did nothing less than say that his voice fills the void left by the death of James Baldwin. And the New Yorker's David Remnick called the book extraordinary. A.O. Scott of the New York Times went further, calling it essential, like water or air. It's getting that kind. Of course, everything that Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of does gets, I think, kind of turns to gold these days. I mean, the stuff that he writes seems to just rise above everything else. So joining us right now is Gene Seymour, freelance culture critic, occasional contributor to CNN.com, Book Forum, and The Nation. He's actually doing an essay on the Coates book for a forthcoming Book Forum issue. He's joining us from the studios at WHYY in Philadelphia. Interestingly, Ta-Nehisi Coates was just on the Terry Gross Fresh Air broadcast right before this one, which originates also from WHYY. Gene Seymour, welcome back to our show.
Great to be back, Colin.
So do you know yet, I don't know whether you've written your essay or you're writing your essay, do you know what tack you're going to take? What interests you most about this book?
I'm literally today just starting to sort of put something together. And you know how the process goes when you're trying to write something, you sort of grab at whatever's swirling around you. But my initial reactions, and I finished reading the book last Thursday. And it coincided, finishing the book coincided, I was watching CNN, and there was a bumper for the Don Lemon News Hour, or whatever it's called, talking about the takedown of the Confederate flag in Charleston. And the question asked by the headline was, can we move beyond race now? And I came this close to throwing the book, the table, and everything else at the screen, because how totally credulous and foolish that sentiment is. I mean, this book made it clear. You come to the end of this book knowing that nothing's over yet. Nothing has been over for some time. And the very fact that this book is being measured in the shadow of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, and which in turn was measured against the shadow of W.E.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, which came out 110 years ago or so, means that what we've been talking about whenever we talk about race somehow manages to get reconfigured in the same pattern with different details. So it was an interesting conversation. I think what that made me believe that more than anything, this book speaks to its moment, the way that Baldwin's did, the way that Du Bois's did, and the place in which relations between the races had come to at the respective points they wrote their book. And I think it has the great merits of Coates's book are very much tied to the moment and the way people are paying attention to what's been going on. It was pushed up, obviously, because of events in South Carolina and all the events that preceded it, the varied and myriad incidents involving police and African Americans. And I think that it's going to gain a certain amount of currency for it, emotionally and otherwise.
I'm also wondering who you think is the more salient audience for this book. I mean, in some ways, because the book is framed as a letter to his son. In a way, it could be argued that he's seeing things that African American people know better than white people know. So I'm wondering whether you think that this is a book that he really hopes that white people are going to read, or whether he thinks this is more of a guide to African American people about how to explain really fundamental things to the rest of the world.
I think it's both to a certain extent. I think it's less so a message directly at white people the way, say, The Fire Next Time was aimed directly. Remember, that came out in 1963 at the very flashpoint of the nonviolent movement and all the convergences of events, violent and otherwise, that were taking place that year. And so that's where the urgency came in. And Baldwin's book basically, brought people up to the moment where we are now, that on the one hand, you had this very, you had protesters in the South carrying on this movement and trying to make change. On the other end, you had the Nation of Islam. You had Malcolm X sort of speaking this kind of apocalyptic message about race relations that needed to be heard and heeded. And so Baldwin, I think, was speaking to that moment in his own letter to his nephew. That was one of the essays in that book, and I think it's no accident that Coates has taken this particular tack. And the book does have quite a few elements of his own autobiography. Again, it is a letter to his 15-year-old son. He talks about being raised in Baltimore. Some of you who have read his previous work know his story. He was raised by a black nationalist father who was very strict and disciplinarian. He went to Howard University, where some of the certainties he had grown up with were challenged, and he became a more rounded intellectual figure because of what he had learned. But then he talks about some of the other things, the kind of haphazard indignities and injustices that have happened to him and also to his friends. A considerable part of his book is devoted to the death of somebody he knew at Howard University, and he died at the hands of police in Prince George's County near Washington, D.C., which is a predominantly black suburb, which is kind of an unpleasant truth he brings out about this, that it isn't always white-black, but it's simply black people against power or whatever's perceived as power.
Although that young man had been mistakenly identified, right, as a criminal suspect.
Yes, that's right.
Had been tailed by, I think, undercover police.
That's right. That's right.
And then died at their hands. That's
right. That's right. And bringing all these elements into it, he's trying to also bring in the fact that, yes, it's still the same, but there are all these other factors that enter into it of class, which is something that Baldwin's book didn't really get into as much. the kind of class contradictions, the kinds of expectations that people have, the fact that the things that are said to you in anger in public venues have a resonance or a tripwire effect that a white person wouldn't have. He mentioned several incidents like this, and it winds up, I think, and this is key here. It winds up, Baldwin's book ended with a kind of exhortation to change, with the expectation that if people listened to this exhortation, things would change. Well, I think Coates's conclusion isn't quite as optimistic I think the way, I'm not sure I'd call it pessimistic either. I think it's more resigned to the fact that this struggle continues. And
one way that's been interpreted is that, although this doesn't really help in terms of any kind of Baldwin-Coates dichotomy, but one way that's been interpreted is that so much of the language of the civil rights movement, of the movement for change in America vis-a-vis Black America has come within the context of the Christian churches. Obviously,
right.
its leading spokesman is the Reverend Martin Luther King, but even beyond that, even the incredible moment we saw a few weeks ago with President Obama singing "Amazing Grace,"
right.
and that Coates just isn't that guy, right? That he's an atheist. He was not brought up in any kind of religion whatsoever, and you almost get the feeling that's one of the differences, right? He doesn't really have a place to hang the message of hope.
No, he doesn't. Except in, if there is any hope to be derived, it's in the very intellectual rigor he brings to some very emotional topics. I think that's the kind of thing that a sensitive, open reader, I'm thinking of a white reader, but obviously I'm also thinking of African-American readers, can get from reading this book, which by the way, you were going to mention this, I'm sure, but his previous breakthrough came last year with the publication of an extensive Atlantic Monthly article making the case for reparations, a controversial, provocative, but scarily persuasive article about the injustices, and using the example of Chicago real estate redlining and things like that as examples. This book is kind of an emotional underpinning for an emotional hypertext for that very clear-eyed investigative report. He gives you the emotional feeling. There's one key line that he uses. There are many, many stretches of beautiful writing, but there's one key line he says to his son at some point, which just stops you, no matter who you are. He says, "The entire narrative of this country argues against the truth of who you are," which I think speaks volumes about just the way every person of color has felt at one point or another, regardless of ideology, class, or religious persuasion, at some point, that everything that's been built up, everything that gets asserted, somehow leaves or excludes the reality of who they are as individuals, never mind who they are collectively, because we all know that collective judgments have lapses, in terms of taking into account just who people are. And I think that sentence, to me, kind of crystallized just what this book is about and what he is telling his son and all the information that he puts in there to buttress that information. It's
in the language, you said it's an emotional underpinning to the sort of policy-oriented and intellectual argument of the reparations article. It's also very visceral. I mean, really, really visceral at the level of viscera, of the body. He talks a lot about the body. We're going to just we'll play a little clip of Coates reading from his own book. I don't know if I said the book is called Between the World and Me. This is him. Right. He's reading this book on NPR's Morning Edition last week. Here's a little passage.
"Now at night I held you, in a great fear, wide as all our American generations took me. Now I personally understood my father and the old mantra, either I can beat him or the police. I understood it all, the cable wires, the extension cords, the ritual switch. Black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You are all we have, and you come to us endangered. I think we would like to kill you ourselves before seeing you killed in the streets that America made. That is a philosophy of the disembodied, of a people who control nothing, who can protect nothing, who are made to fear not just the criminals among them, but the police who lord over them with all the moral authority of a protection racket."
So that's Ta-Nehisi Coates reading. And Gene Seymour, he just comes back to this idea of the body over and over again. Yep. He writes to Samora, you must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And he makes this argument that, in fact, there's just this violence that runs through life under those circumstances, that his father is more violent towards him than a white father would have to be, that he has to learn to live in a neighborhood where violence is around him all the time, not just from the police, but from his peers, from his colleagues. But, to me, and I'm wondering what you think about this, that, one of the things that Ta-Nehisi Coates has kind of been over the last few years is kind of an alternative voice to President Obama at times. And they get on each other's nerves, too. They've had kind of little run-ins. And that whole line about the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, to me, that's sort of him saying, you know what, I want to write something a lot more direct than the stuff that the president says. I want to talk at a visceral level of what it's like to be black, because I just feel like he doesn't do that. I don't know. Do you think some of this is kind of directed at the way that President Obama, when he's not being incredible the way he was when he sang Amazing Grace, the way that President Obama kind of, he's unsatisfactory to a Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Yeah, I don't see it as conflict so much, Colin, as one doing, each man is doing his job. Mm-hmm. He's carrying out his function in whatever this is, this social dynamic is. It's the president's function to be the president of all people, and to persuade and negotiate and navigate his way through political thickets. People like Ta-Nehisi Coates are there to feed the matter, to feed the matter, some of the raw matter of what needs to be negotiated, what needs to be added to the negotiations, I think, is what people like Ta-Nehisi Coates is. And I just want to bring up, when you were playing that passage, it reminded me, the title of this book, Between the World and Me, comes from a poem by Richard Wright. And Wright's own language, which was, unlike Baldwin's, very direct and blunt and edgy and violent, I think is more has more connections with the style of this book than Baldwin's, in my opinion. I'm not trying to place any. It's all there. It all gets filtered in somehow. There's even some Toni Morrison in there, but it all gets filtered in somehow. But I think that Richard Wright's voice is every bit as prominent in the making of this book, particularly as any of the other progenitors, people like Baldwin and Ellison and the rest.
I thought one of the other remarkable observations he makes in this book, and I've just never thought about it this way. He actually talks for a moment. He talks so much about violence in the book and about the assault on the body, but he has this incredible passage where he says, "It struck me that perhaps the defining feature of being drafted into the black race was that inescapable robbery of time, because the moments we spend readying the mask or readying ourselves to accept half as much could not be recovered. The robbery of time is not measured in lifespans, but in the moments we lose. It is the last bottle of wine that you have just uncorked but do not have time to drink. It is the second kiss that you do not have time to share before she walks out of your life. It is the raft of second chances for them and 23-hour days for us." Boy, I hadn't really thought about that robbery of time. There's the extra time it takes.
Yeah, and you've just given, I think, that passage gives you an idea of, you talked about the audience for this book earlier. Who's this meant for? When I read those lines, I go, yeah, that strikes a chord with me. I mean, I have felt that way. I have felt, that what's wrong with me, and how come nobody else notices that I'm walking through this a kind of hostile world, and I'm being me, and yet somehow I'm not being me. It gets back to Ellison's whole, motif of the invisible man. You see everything but me. And every one of these books, whenever they're submitted, is a brief for acknowledging the personality of each individual African American. We are not a mass. We are not a concept. And you and I agree that race, the concept of race, is basically a silly, stupid concept, an abstraction. But the only thing that's stupider about it is ignoring its significance deserved or not in most of the transactions we make in American life. I mean, that's just the way it is. And I think that for you had that kind of those lines had that kind of impact on you. For me, they confirm something in me that I didn't or couldn't quite articulate until someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is younger than I am, who has had different experiences than I have, nonetheless feels as acutely as I have.
Yeah,
I think that's the value for a black audience, I think.
Yeah. Well, I had this conversation about a couple of weeks ago when this whole question of Calhoun College at Yale University came up, and I got in touch with my roommate of 3 years of Yale, who is African American, and I said, I went through 4 years of Yale with you, 3 years living with you. I don't remember this. Is this something people talked about? And he said, and we're both left-handed. He said, being black is a little bit like being left-handed. If you're left-handed, you really notice things. But if you're not,
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great metaphor. Obviously, there's so much more that's pernicious and disturbing and violent and visceral in all the ways that Coates writes about that is not true about being left-handed. But it's a great way to look at it. And I feel like back to President Obama, I thought he really. One of his most Coatsian moments was when he was running in 2008, and there were people asking if he was black enough. Remember that?
Yep.
And he said at one point he said, "When I'm trying to hail a cab in New York, it turns out I'm pretty black."
Yep, that's the way I felt too. I mean that's how dumb these discussions get. I did a piece for CNN.com about not being black enough or not being considered black enough, and all the things I went through on that score from both white and black people over my entire life, and this kind of, the way one speaks, the way one conducts themselves, whether you listen to the Beatles or not. I mean, these are the kind of silly, things that come up and that measure this ridiculous thing of authenticity, which I'm a concept that I'm less and less patient with. And I think what comes through in this what may distinguish this book from its predecessors is the fact that he is finding a higher, truer authenticity by taking all the different experiences he's had, the way that he sees the criminal element in his Baltimore neighborhood as being, as acting out of fear, as being afraid that this aggression, this criminal activity, comes from the same sense of fear that Ta-Nehisi Coates, feels. That's a perspective that truly is authentic in the ways that all the other silly things of being black or not being black enough are not. So I think in identifying those things, he manages to at least begin the process of transcending some of the baggage we've been carrying from the last time we talked about this in public, or the last books that were published,
We're talking to Gene Seymour right now, and he's a freelance culture critic, writer, and occasional contributor to CNN.com, Book Forum, and The Nation. We hope to have him on again later this week if it all works out. But we're talking about the book, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're sort of running out of time here, but you kind of answered the question that I wanted to ask you, which was, is this going to be different somehow? It's being set up that way. I mean, certainly a lot of pressure is being put on this book. I mean, the kind of anointing that has gone on, not only from Toni Morrison, but from various white critics and establishment figures. Does it feel like that? Does it feel like that it really is a kind of watershed book, that it really might explain things that haven't been explained properly before?
As I say, it's a book for and of its moment. And when you write something and when you publish something that's of its moment, the question is, how long does that moment last? In some cases, it depends on whether things move along progressively or move ahead as they should, or whether some of the things that he talks about. And I'm not saying the book is flawless. There are parts of the book that I think things kind of tend to get away from him as he's trying to make his points. But I think it all depends really on how long and how much people are engaged in the things that have happened leading up to the publication of this book. I think that's what's going to be the key here, and how much that carries into the next few months, the next year, the election year, whether we're still talking about these things or trying to do something about them, that I think will be the measurement of whether this book lasts or not.
All right, Gene Seymour, thanks so much for joining us for this. We're going to come back and have a conversation about a different book, a very different book by Ted Cruz.
About love, justice.
We are back, and it's Monday, and we're doing the Scramble. But we're doing kind of a special publishing-oriented Scramble, talking about 3 different books that are arriving on the scene. They do different things. The ones that kind of bookend this conversation have more in common than the book we're going to talk about right now, and that is the new book by Ted Cruz. It's called A Time for Truth. Ted Cruz has gotten into a battle with the New York Times, a battle which is very gratifying and useful to Ted Cruz, maybe not so much for the New York Times, about whether or not this book belongs on the bestseller list. Joining us right now is Dylan Byers, media reporter at Politico, maybe the guy who broke this story, certainly the first guy I saw writing about this story. Dylan Byers, how did this battle get joined? How did Ted Cruz decide that he had some kind of argument to make with the New York Times about whether he should be on the bestseller list?
Sure. Well, if you're the author of a potentially best-selling book or the publisher of that book, you are looking at your own sort of internal numbers provided by Nielsen Bookscan, and those numbers are telling you that sales are going gangbusters. In the case of Ted Cruz's book, you've got more than 11,000 books sold in the first week. By any measure, you'd think that would put you very high up on the New York Times bestsellers list, which is an important place to be. It's one of the most influential lists of best-selling books in the country. So when the New York Times sends over its advance of the bestsellers list to HarperCollins, and HarperCollins sees that the book is not on the list, they inquire about it. And what they got back, which is what the Times has now stated publicly, is that the book does not meet its criteria for inclusion, and that's specifically because it was driven by bulk sales, meaning that the implication there is that the Cruz campaign or someone affiliated with the Cruz campaign tried to jack up sales by buying these books in bulk. But of course, HarperCollins and now Amazon, the biggest internet retailer in the country, say they have no evidence of any bulk purchases taking place.
So would it be fair to say that we're kind of at a point, and we're talking to Dylan Byers from Politico, that we're kind of at a point where a battle has been joined which only Ted Cruz can win. That he is, first of all, obviously in the thick of a Republican primary where the best thing you can be is at swords points with the New York Times. So, I mean, he sort of wins either way, right? I mean, if he doesn't get on the bestseller list, fine.
Yeah, I mean, you could make the argument, and I think it'd be the right one, that Ted Cruz won as soon as this battle began. I mean, the only way that Ted Cruz really loses this battle is if Amazon and HarperCollins aren't standing by him, if it turns out that there is evidence that his campaign made bulk purchases. That sends a signal, I think, to any thinking person that the campaign is not on the up and up and that it's lying and that it's trying to manipulate the candidate's popularity, et cetera. But insofar as we're just arguing over different methodologies of how you measure book sales, yeah, absolutely. Conservatives have rallied around Ted Cruz yet again. There is no one that they love to beat up on more than the New York Times, and when they see the New York Times beating up on a conservative candidate, they rally behind that candidate.
You know, one of the things that I wanted to find out right away, I think right now the New York Times has a very excellent and interesting public editor named Margaret Sullivan, who doesn't seem to be afraid to rattle the cages around her own building if she has to. And I guess she'd been away for a few days. She came back and found this as one of the this tempest that was brewing in her teapot. And you know, she published this response that you've also obtained as well. I think from I think her name is Ellen Murphy, a spokesperson for the New York Times. And near the end of this response, Murphy says, we aren't going to discuss the details of how we do our analysis, since the whole point is to try to minimize the possibility that people can manipulate the numbers. You know, Dylan, I found this kind of troubling. You know, I mean, I as a public radio host, I should be siding with the New York Times against Ted Cruz. But there's something, sure. I just feel as though, first of all, the New York Times, they say that they're going to be transparent. I mean, post Jason Blair, Bill Keller made all these pronouncements about we're not going to rely on anonymous sources as much and all this kind of stuff. But every time you ask them for something, and here they've effectively, as you say, accused Ted Cruz of trying to manipulate his bestseller ratings, and then they're going to refuse to also explain how they arrive at their conclusions. To me, I found that kind of distasteful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the Times would like to be, I think, the New York Times, like the Obama administration before Obama became president, would like to be the sort of model of transparency. And I think that its commitment to that is ultimately an admirable one. But yeah, I don't see how I don't see how you make the situation any worse if you just come forward and say, look, this is how we measure best-selling books, right? I mean, I think if it's an honest assessment of sales and a true reflection of reader interest in whatever books are out that week, I don't really think there's any way to game that. And I don't think that by just coming clean on what your sort of methodology is, that you would somehow screw up that process or tempt more people toward foul play.
Dylan Byers, at some point, if this controversy continues to rage on, you may have to read A Time for Truth. Or have you read it already? Have you read the Ted Cruz book?
I absolutely have not read it. The truth is I'm just far too busy trying to keep track of these warring statements between these various factions in order to actually read the book. What I think is interesting, though, on that point is it's interesting to think of book sales as a measure of interest in presidential candidates, right? I mean, if we were going solely on book sales, you would have some of these candidates like Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Bernie Sanders ginning up a lot more support than, say, you would among like some of the more mainstream candidates that we see certainly on the right in Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio. I mean, Cruz's book far outpaced Marco Rubio's book, which has been out for six months, but whether or not that translates to votes is obviously a different story.
Well, I think it's kind of a roulette wheel, too. I mean, obviously, Audacity of Hope was, I think, a great articulation point for President Obama. It can be a way to win, but, for Hillary Clinton, the book that she put out last year, I mean, people hated it. People who would be part of her kind of intellectual base rejected it and said it was a horrible, collection of pablum. And yeah, it seems as like this stuff gets fought out almost at a comic level. There are even arguments going on. PolitiFact, as you no doubt know, fact-checked Donald Trump's usual slurry, blurry, half-mumbled, semi-retracted statement that his book, The Art of the Deal, in 1987 was the best-selling business book of all time.
Right. Well, these books that candidates write are almost necessarily boring and bad books unless you've got nothing to lose, unless you can just rail against something, unless you can, in the case of Ted Cruz, you can rail against big government and the media, or in the case of Bernie Sanders, you can rail against Republicans. But the candidates who are actually running very serious campaigns, who actually have a chance of winning this thing, they almost by necessity need to write just terribly tedious books in order to not stir the pot. And in fact, the exception to that rule, of course, is President Obama's first book, which I think was written a long time before he really knew he was going to be running for president in 2008.
But it was a great, it was sort of a strategic move before he even knew he needed a strategy, because it took, took a whole bunch of things right off the table. Dylan Byers, so great to talk to you. Really enjoy your reporting. Dylan Byers, media reporter for Politico. We're going to take a quick break here. We're going to come back with our final publishing story. That is the Harper Lee story. All right, we're back. Chion Wolf had to go home early today, and as a result, Lydia Brown has been on the board. I've been hurling abuse at her, attempting to make her burst into tears. It has not worked so far. She's doing a great job. Tucker Ives also produced this show with help from Chion. Katie Tolarski is our executive producer. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. Our interns today are Anna Geismar and Hallie St. Germain. Allison Ehrenreich, the part of Bill Curry, was played by Gregory Peck. For everything you missed today, including the videos of the Faith Middleton Show staff making recipes from the New York Times bestselling Mike Huckabee cookbook. Visit our website, WNPR.org. Tomorrow, the colorful and necessarily tragic story of Stalin's daughter. You think your parents are embarrassing. Now we're going back to the show. I have to get one more piece of publishing news in. Bloom County, the Brooke Brathwaite comic strip. You have to be a certain age to be excited about this because it's been away for 25 years. But anyway, it's a great comic strip. It's coming back. That was just announced. Joining us now is Julia Pestel. She's done everything there is to do in Hartford, including produce this show, and has also recently written a wonderful piece about why she lives in Hartford for the Hartford Courant. But I think most saliently, she's one of the hosts of the podcast Literary Disco. She's here today to talk to us about the new Harper Lee novel, or the new old prequel written before To Kill a Mockingbird.
Prequel, sequel.
Whatever it is. Yeah, it's a prequel and a sequel. Anyway, so you're here to talk about this. First of all, you're very passionate about books, but beyond that, you're very passionate about Harper Lee specifically and To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic. And this whole situation is, I mean, it's the equivalent of like your grandfather's on his deathbed and you like find Nazi memorabilia in his attic. I mean, this is what's happening with this book is Harper Lee has, agreed under some suspicious circumstances to have this book published. And it turns out Atticus Finch, one of the most beloved, if not the most beloved character in American literature, has turned out to be a giant racist all along.
Just for the record, my grandfather fought with Rommel in North Africa. He was not aware of so when we say Nazi, remember. But anyway, so there's so many things going on here, and obviously the book doesn't come out until tomorrow. But there's been quite a bit of hand-wringing and pearl clutching already about the fact that, so Atticus is not depicted as this incredible dispenser of justice, that he's narrow-minded, he's a little bit bigoted, but he's the first draft of Atticus. This is the first draft of Atticus. She made other choices when it was suggested to her by the editor that she write a different novel.
Sure, and I think we share the belief that we need to remind people that Atticus is not a real person. So is the question that's kind of swirling around is this the same character, or are these two versions? Is one of these like fan fiction of the other? But I was also reading today about her father, Harper Lee's father, and his own views on race. And apparently he was a segregationist and had more in common with the Atticus in Go Set a Watchman. So one of the speculative questions that we have no right to ask, but I will, is did that aspect of his character get pulled back because her father was still alive at the time? I want
to mention we're live here in the afternoon. If you've pre-ordered the book, or if now you're wishing you hadn't pre-ordered the book or something like that, give us a call, 860-275-7266. Or if you never intended to read this book ever anyway, 860-275-7266. You may tweet at us at WNPR Colin. Our tweet master Greg Hill is back in the house. He may, in fact, tweet back at you. Well, you went back to you said this thing about how Atticus is not a real person, which I agree with you about. But he's as close to a real person as a fictional character can be. People name their children after him. He's in our heads in all kinds of different ways. He's in our heads as Gregory Peck in the movie. He's in our heads as what he is in the book. This is a character who, we really sort of are in Pirandello country here, right? This is a character who really exists in a way that's almost a little bit independent of authorial intent. People have taken this character and run with him.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, one of my reactions is I'm sort of amused by the whole thing because I feel like this is what we deserve. We basically demanded to read this early draft and then we get a character that we don't like. And, I think a lot of people will join me in pointing out that Atticus was never perfect. And there have been many, many reactions to Kill a Mockingbird that have pointed out his really paternalistic views on race, and he was really never perfect all along. So it's us as readers and as a culture who have made him an exemplary figure, and now that's gone. Now that's taken away.
I'll name drop here and say that I had to do an event with Gregory Peck years ago at the Bushnell where I brought him out on stage, and I said that he had really influenced American life and American mores. I said, personally, I can't shoot a rabid dog without putting my glasses, like everything. But he's sort of that iconic. But yeah, I feel as though we've parked a lot of ideas in him that are sort of there and sort of not there. And I wrote a blog post earlier today saying, in a way, he really is the embodiment of America. he has a consciousness of justice that's strong enough so that when he sees a miscarriage of justice, he can't let it stand, and he'll risk his own safety for it. He'll do almost anything to save Tom Robinson from what he regards as an unfair set of charges, and also to preserve his right to the kind of trial that he should have. So in this almost hopeless quest to preserve justice, he'll do this. But the criticism of him is he doesn't have – it's kind of the Ta-Nehisi Coates criticism in a way. He doesn't really have a critique of the overall system. It's just the case that's right in front of him, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he'll say he'll do almost anything. That's right. He'll do almost anything. He's still polite to his very racist neighbors. And he doesn't go all the way. He's not an activist. So one thing I'm really interested in with this new book, which I have not read, but I read the first chapter, as I assume you have, is what Scout's role is going to be. Is Scout going to be our new Atticus? Is this the white liberal that we're going to get for our current time of this 25-year-old girl who has strong views of race? And will the original novel now be reversed? Will she be teaching her father empathy and progressive ideals?
Let's grab a call here from Beth in West Hartford. Hi, Beth. You're on the air. Our number, by the way, 860-275-7266. We're on the air with Julia Pistel. Hi, Beth. What's up?
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. I haven't heard you guys make a comment about this other than the fact that I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but that the guest on speculates that there's some suspicion about it. Well, my speculation is that To Kill a Mockingbird was written as the second book. It was the first book published, however, and I don't think it's accidental that 50 years later that Harper Lee presumably didn't want to have the second book published because it's an entirely different new Atticus, new persona, and the fact I don't know, suspicious. It's to me beyond suspicion that I see it as two separate books. She grew up. She wrote To Kill a Mockingbird and changed Atticus. So how it is that you'd relate the two books, she wrote this second book first. So I'm just wondering what you think about that, if I made any sense at all.
Well, you made sense, although I don't think it's a matter of her growing up, because this all happened kind of in one span. In other words, she submitted Go Set a Watchman to a publisher. The publisher said, no, I think you need to tell the story a different way, and she went back and wrote that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I was reading a really interesting piece in the New York Times, if I may say something positive about them after the last segment, about her editor, who is a great editor named Tay Hayhoff, and what the recommendations she made on the book. Now, I think that, it's worth combing through all the articles about whether or not Harper Lee, really consented to having this work published after all of her protectors have died, including her editors and her sister. But we'll never know. We'll never know if she really consented. But one thing that I think is really worth noting, and this is going to come out over and over again, is at least based on this first chapter, the book's just not as good, period. The writing is messier. It hasn't been edited at all by the publisher's own admission, just like copy editing. So it's not even a finished work. So there's a lot of comparisons to be made, not just with Atticus. So it's really hard to do a direct one-to-one. It's not like she rewrote it only changing Atticus's perspective.
I think we have this incredible insatiable appetite for more of the things that we like.
Oh God, I know, I hate it.
And then it's like what you said. We get what we deserve in a certain way, because it's like after everybody read everything that Tolkien had written, I think his son Christopher tried to finish the Silmarillion or something. You just know. Don't even go. Don't do it. Don't just stay with what you've got. You know what you've got. You love it. You care about it. Read it again if you haven't read it in 10 years. But instead, it's like, no, we really want to see this.
Yeah, I know. I really, it's sad. And however, what I think is really interesting about this case is Harper Lee is in no condition to kind of respond and explain herself and engage in a public discourse. She's just in the opposite situation of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's engaging with the public all the time, doing tons of speakings. We're going to have to do the same work of figuring out what she intended that we do with To Kill a Mockingbird.
Absolutely. By the way, Teresa Kramer tweets to us the whole thing. She won't read this book until she can buy a used copy, because she thinks that Lee never wanted us to read this book. And there's a sense that this is about money at some level, that that somebody feels like they can get some money out of this.
Oh, yeah. But would we be this upset if Harper Lee had been dead for 5 years? I don't know. It just feels sort of weird to be reading it while she's still kind of in the room.
There's something about her. She's vulnerable somehow.
Yeah.
In a way that a living person can be. Here's a call from Steve in Springfield. Hi, Steve.
Hey, how are you? All right. I'm going to get in trouble asking this question, but so I graduated from high school and college, and I never read it. Which one should I read first now?
First of all, you have to go stand in a diorama, as the person who hasn't read To Kill a Mockingbird. But, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that we don't know because nobody – I mean, Tucker just got his ebook delivered seconds ago. He's going to get it before his ebook has arrived of Go Set a Watchman. So he's going to get it before the stores open tomorrow when you and I go there dressed as Boo Radley. I mean, it's hard to give anybody advice about this, but I mean, it seems to me, you'd probably be fine if you just. This is going to turn out to be like how you used to beg your parents to let you stay up late and watch The Tonight Show or something, and then they finally did, and it wasn't,
I still think it's important to read To Kill a Mockingbird first for two reasons. One is that assuming the second book is not as well written, you want to read the better book first, the more engaging book first. But also, I mean, To Kill a Mockingbird is the story of a little girl realizing, that racism pervades her community and learning how to empathize. I mean, it's not just about Atticus and the trial. It's also about Boo Radley and all these other folks, to put it in Atticus terms, that she's learning to empathize with, which is the same. I mean, that's a universal American story. That's Huck Finn. That's so many other books. Whereas Go Set a Watchman is a much more political kind of work. So I think just for sheer engagement, I would still read To Kill a Mockingbird first. It's
amazing what a Rosetta Stone this book is. And I think, you mentioned Huck Finn. It kind of belongs, maybe there's sort of a troika of Huck Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird and maybe Catcher in the Rye, although people seem to be having more problems with that book now than they used to. But just the articulation of the viewpoint of a young American at some particular moment. And I'm right. I just by chance am reading The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich, which won the National Book Award a few years ago. And it could not have been written without To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm sure Louise Erdrich would tell you that, too, that something about the voice of this book and the perspective of this book and what was done by the editor who said, go write this book from the point of view of children is just it is crucial in a way that you almost can't even quantify.
Yeah, and I haven't read The Roundhouse, but in the case of To Kill a Mockingbird and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, it's also really important to say this is the viewpoints of young white children learning about race and their community and how to empathize and recognizing their own privilege, to put it in the modern parlance. And that's really important. And so it's important to note that. And that's why Go Set a Watchman might not actually be that different, because it's not like it's taking one of the characters from the black community and changing it. It's just taking the same story and shoving it forward a couple decades.
Yeah. The Roundhouse it's To Kill a Mockingbird from the point of view of 12-year-old Native American boys.
Oh, cool.
It really actually is. I'm halfway through it, and it's just an amazing book. I should say, by point of correction, that Tucker his physical book has actually arrived at his house, which we're going to say is in Old Saybrook, so people don't come and steal it from where his house actually is.
Tucker would never live in Old Saybrook.
That's probably true, actually. But yeah, I just very quickly, we're almost out of time. But it seems to me there's two things that this book does that To Kill a Mockingbird did, which is one of them is just its voice. It gets a voice, just in the same way that Huck did, just in the same way that Holden Caulfield is a voice. And then, of course, it does, as you say, has this story to tell about race, the way Huck did, too. But those are kind of two different things. And if in that first chapter you already hear that flatness, that the voice is gone, to me, it's like, why spend an afternoon reading?
We don't know what the story is yet. We don't know if it's not a coming of age story of a young girl. What is it? Is it a story where a girl gets really depressed about the state of her own family? I mean, maybe
it could be. All right, Julia Pastel, who is the host of Literary Disco, add it to your podcast list if you haven't already. We have to thank everybody, especially Lydia Brown, who I did not succeed in making cry. Lydia, I don't really have anything to yell at you about. You did a great job.
So far to go.